disappointed at the start of the meeting because I really did want to have the opportunity to talk about Senate Bill 142, and I was outside the room talking with some advocates, and we started very close to on time, which doesn't usually happen. And so I missed the opportunity. I came in as the vote had already begun, and it was very disappointing for me because I had a great many questions to ask, and I really wanted to use the opportunity for the debate on that bill to kind of connect with the bill that we're debating right now. So there's a few topics that we're going to get into today. But I think that the first thing that we have to ask ourselves about this legislation is the first question we should be asking, and that's, whose property is it? The bill that's before us effectively says, just for the edification of the people listening, that the agreement that they have both signed into voluntarily of their own free will is no longer valid. I heard our House chairman a few minutes ago on another bill suggest that it would be wrong to break a binding contract, and that was on the conversation regarding the changing of a rental fee during the term of a lease. Well, one of the terms of a lease agreement is the effective date and the expiration date of that lease. And what this bill aims to do is negate the fact that both parties have agreed to the term of the contract, that the date that it's supposed to end is no longer relevant. And I take issue with that because what it does is it deprives the owner of the property from their own property by virtue of setting up a scheme where they have to meet certain criteria in order to reclaim their own property. And there are so many aspects of this bill that I want to talk about and get into, but to me, that's the number one factor. We have an obligation as lawmakers. We take an oath to our state and our U.S. Constitution, and in the process, we validate the importance of the rights of our constituents. We swear to protect and uphold their rights, and one of their rights is the right to private property. And any legislation that interferes with the rights of our constituents, the people that effectively vote for us to come up here and make policy, when we're making policy that interferes with their rights, I think we're making a mistake. During the last debate, I wrote down the phrase freedom versus force. And I wrote that down because I think that's what we're looking at with a lot of these bills. And the previous discussion was about these housing authorities, and the argument was made that housing authorities can enter into other jurisdictions freely with the approval of the receiving destination jurisdiction. That's freedom. That is the way things are supposed to work in our society. We allow people, individuals, towns to interact with one another and decide what agreements they want to make of their own free will. And instead of freedom, what we're getting from this body and many of the committees that are writing policy right now in this building is force. We're getting the government taking away the freedom of the people to engage in commerce and exercise their rights freely. And what's frustrating is that many of these bills are always framed as if they're doing something positive. And that one, the last conversation was all about, well, these housing authorities are great and they can do all these amazing things. Well, and that's true. They can, but they should only be able to do that in the places they're authorized and with the freedom and of partners that want to be involved. And since that's not happening to the degree that some folks would like to see happening, they're using this state government to create law and policy that imposes force on the receiving municipality in that particular case. And so I'll connect that with this bill by saying that that's what this bill is about. That there is this constant refrain that we're, by enacting such a policy, we're benefiting the lives of tenants or tenant applicants, and that we're making things better for them. The fact of the matter is this body doesn't have the power to do that. I mean, the government doesn't make things better. The minimum wage, I always use an example. The minimum wage gave people a wage. No, it did not. It did not. All it did was ban opportunities for jobs that paid less than that wage. And, of course, some people did certainly benefit and ultimately ended up getting a higher wage, but not for the same job. Their job changed because it's just a fact of nature. People don't give up things for free. None of us would pay more for an item than we actually feel it's worth. I'm not going to, pay $300 for a pair of shoes that I think are worth $50. I'm just not going to do it. Nobody would pay, $500 for a $100 dress or $50,000 for a $20,000 car and so on. And that applies to everything in our society. Things have a value and people are free to decide what that value is unless, and the unless is the important part, the government comes along to dictate certain terms of those agreements. And that's what's happening in this bill, is that is no longer a free agreement anymore when it comes to a lease agreement. I think that everyone who applies for an apartment to rent has an opportunity to look at the document and discuss the terms with the landlord. Now, maybe the landlord's unreasonable and doesn't want to change the terms, or maybe they are. But at the end of the day, the tenant and the landlord both are going to put their signature down on that document to say that they are living with the terms of that agreement. And of course, not every agreement is completely fair, and I'm the first one to acknowledge that. Sometimes people are in a bind; they have to force terms that they don't like. I don't like how much I pay for my cable service. I can tell you that much. But I got no choice. I mean, they're the only game in town, and if I want to have it, I gotta pay. And that's the driving force for change in the marketplace, by the way, is when you have pressure created by people that are unhappy with their circumstances. That creates opportunity for others to jump in there and say, well, I can offer the same service for less. The problem is that when government becomes one of your competitors, it's very difficult to challenge them because the government has so many more advantages. Not only can they write laws to benefit their success and hurt the competition, they also have unlimited resources, as I mentioned. I'm going to just say a few words about this bill before we get really rolling, and then I'm going to go through the language of the bill in some detail. But I want to say just a few things. First off, I mentioned private property rights. I think this also affects freedom of association, which is another constitutional protection that we have that says that people should not be forced into relationships that they don't want to be in, and they should be able to leave relationships if they choose as well. I believe that this is a direct violation of what was termed a binding contract. And I think this will have an unbelievably negative effect on the way rental real estate transactions occur in the future. I think this policy shows a lack of understanding of American principles and why America is a successful country. And we can talk about that at much more length, but I'll leave it right there for that. I think it shows a lack of understanding of the term rights. I keep hearing people say things like, property is or housing is a human right. In other forums, you might hear healthcare is a human right. I want to talk about that at some length. I think this bill shows a lack of understanding of economics, of supply and demand, about market principles. I think it shows a direct understanding of the more specific content of what actually is happening out in the rental marketplace. This is something I have expertise in. I noted earlier today that the chairman has significant experience in some areas that I don't. She's talked about housing authorities, which is something I admittedly I don't know much about, and she clearly does. But this particular topic, I'd venture to guess that on the committee as a whole, I probably have the most direct experience of being involved in hundreds, maybe thousands of real estate transactions and agreements. I believe this proposal is unconstitutional. Some of my questions and answers and dialogue will be purposely to point out the portions of the legislation that I feel do not comport with our state and federal constitutions. And I also think this is somewhat un-American because I think it does go against our free market principles and instead imposes authoritarian rule that eliminates freedom of choice. I wrote down a note here to read a quote from a reporter in Connecticut, Chris Powell. He wrote a story a couple days ago about our public hearing on this bill. And I'll just read it. It's two short paragraphs. He said, "In such a political environment, Connecticut will be lucky to get construction of any rental housing, and then only the most expensive kind. Forget affordable rental housing. No one will invest in it when rent increases and evictions are prohibited. If the proposed restrictions on landlords are enacted, people who already have apartments may keep them longer, but the stock of rental housing will decline and deteriorate as profits are drained, and tenants will have been more selfish than landlords." Now, I don't agree with his last statement because I don't blame anyone. I don't blame landlords or tenants. The fact of the matter is they're doing exactly what they're supposed to do, which is trying to get the most they can out of a transaction with one another. What I have a problem with is the government. Big government is what is hurting us in so many areas because it is separating us from one another into various factions and groups that no longer see eye to eye or are willing to negotiate as they once did. But I'll get more into my commentary after we go through the bill, and I'm going to ask the good chairman some questions as we go. The first question I have is regarding the language in the raised bill, which is Senate Bill 143, LCO 670. And I'm wondering if the chairman can tell me what is happening in Section 1, subsection A1, lines 4 through 15.
This applies to any tenant who's residing in a building or complex of 5 or more dwelling units who reside or who reside in a mobile home park. We've removed the existing. That's being deleted. Is that what you're asking for? 1 through 15?
Madam Chairman, I'm just looking for a layman's explanation of what this language achieves.
So we're removing the language that limits this eviction from people who are in a special class, 62 years of older, and a person with a disability.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. But what is the purpose of removing that language?
Because we're now expanding it to anyone who lives in a complex of 5 or more.
Thank you. And can you speak to why this original legislation may have limited it only to the classes that are described here, which is age 62 and older, a person with physical or mental disability, and also someone who has a physical disability, a person with a physical disability living with them. The current law limits this just cause eviction protection only to this categories, and I'm wondering why that was the case.
Well, I wasn't here when that was enacted, but I would say that the Disability Act had a role to play in it, and something for seniors, that they were protected. They were declared a protected class of people. I don't know what led to that, if there were problems with people being discriminated for age or because of a disability, but I would assume so.
Thank you for that answer, Madam Chairman. Yeah, I mean, the reason why I ask is because, I mean, clearly, this statute was written in the past and this conversation was held before. And the people that had that conversation in the past felt it was appropriate to limit this protection in some way, not to overreach into the realm of depriving the property owner of their rights. And I just bring it up in those terms because I think that's quite clear from the fact that that's what's before us. They had the chance to create this protection for everyone before, but it's never been done. We're attempting to do it in this committee now, but it should give us pause to recognize that we're not the first housing committee to take on this topic, and it was very narrowly tailored in the past, and that's the law that we have currently. Moving on, just out of curiosity, in the subsection 2 of section 1, which begins on line 16, they start talking about something called a conversion tenant. Can you tell me what a conversion tenant is, Madam Chairman?
A conversion tenant would be someone who is in a common interest community and someone else takes over the property.
I understand. There's a lot of new language in this paragraph about manufactured or mobile homes. How are they being affected by this language regarding conversion tenants?
I believe that they were not included in the previous legislation.
Yes, ma'am. And I'm reading on that it appears that they are now going to be included as long as the park has 5 or more units. The moving down to line 43. This is the operative part of the bill. And to me, this is the biggest issue. When we're creating policy, I think it's important to be fair to all sides of private contracts. There's no, it's just a concern of mine that when the state or any level of government decides that they're going to put restrictions on private agreements, that they be careful about not weighting the scale to one side or the other. And that's the issue with this bill, because effectively I think what's happening here is the property owner is losing their protections. The tenant still has the protection of choice in every case. The tenant can sign the original lease agreement, whether they choose to or not, as can the property owner. But when that lease comes up for its expiration or renewal, the choice used to be up to both parties in a mutual agreement to decide whether to extend the terms of that agreement or to change them. And that's going away. Now the choice resides almost solely with the tenant. The property owner has got to go through a very difficult process in order to reclaim their property. And I'm curious to know what the justification is for that, Madam Chairman. Why does the state have a compelling interest to deprive the property owner of their right to their own property after the termination of a lease agreement?
What we heard in testimony from many people, many people, that they had been evicted from their properties without knowing what the reason was. And we're not taking away the 13 reasons that you have to disclose. We're just saying you need to give me one of those reasons as to why you're evicting me.
I appreciate the answer, Madam Chairman, although I take issue with some of it because we're not talking about evictions. The fact of the matter is an eviction is something that takes place where the property owner is resorting to legal means to remove a tenant. That's what an eviction is. A and this is a critical part of this discussion, because a lease contract, it lasts for a specific term, and if it's understood by the parties that it should end on a day, it's understood that at the end of the lease, unless there's an agreement that suits both parties and they're happy with moving forward with it, that is the end of that lease. And what this bill aims to do is to deprive one party to that argument to say that you don't have a choice in that, only the other party does. Which is why I remember asking during the public hearing, I asked someone if you were required to stay if you wanted to go. You wouldn't like that very much. You can't go and move to another property. You have to stay in this apartment, even though the lease ended on this day and we agreed to it. And this is what we're doing to the property owner. We're telling them that they don't have a choice, despite the fact that both parties did sign on the dotted line in advance, knowing full well what the dates were on the contract, a binding contract, as was mentioned. Your reference to 13 reasons, I think, has to do with the language that is in the statute governing fair rent commissions, but that's not what's at stake here. The new requirements are that if a tenant refuses to leave at the end of the lease term that they had already agreed to, for me and for everyone under current law, that's enough. That is enough. That is it. That is a violation of the contract, the same as non-payment of rent or being a nuisance to other tenants or something like that, or damage to the property. The fact of the matter is, not leaving at the last day when the lease expires is a violation of the lease contract. In fact, I'll ask that as a question. Is it the opinion of the chairman of this committee that that is not a violation of a binding lease contract?
I do think it is a violation, but I also think that what we're asking here is to give just cause as to why you're asking someone to leave.
Madam Chairman, I respect that answer, but wouldn't the just cause be you agreed to vacate the premises at the expiration date that is signed in the lease?
I'm not sure about the answer to that. That would be just cause. I can check with my attorney, though.
Senator Sampson, could you repeat the question?
I was simply asking if it's the opinion of the chairman that the expiration date on the contract is or is not enough just cause for a landlord to ask their tenant to leave.
Madam Chair, I don't believe that I'm.
Yeah, I don't think that's exactly the same question. It is. It's not the same question that you asked.
Maybe not in the exact words, but I'd still like an answer.
Well, what we're saying here is that at the end of a contract, we want to know the reason why I'm asked that we're not going to continue the contract.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And I appreciate that. I understand your position, but I'm asking you a very direct question. And that is, do you consider the fact that the tenant signed a contract, a binding contract? You just said it was a binding contract a moment ago. And part of that contract is an expiration date. So is that a breach of that contract or no, that they refuse to leave at the expiration of the term?
I believe without this legislation, it would be.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, and that's the purpose of the bill that's before us, is to eliminate that that reason. Can you think of another time-limited contract where that's an acceptable? I don't know how to phrase this exactly. Where it would be acceptable for one party to ignore the expiration date?
No, I can't think of anything. Maybe you know of one that you could share.
I don't. No, and for me, when I sign a contract, I believe I'm swearing to something. I'm making a promise. I'm committing in writing with my reputation and a written commitment that the other party should be able to rely on in good faith. And I think that this bill, by eliminating that provision, means that people don't have to act in good faith anymore. And I don't think that's a good step forward for the policy making of our state. In fact, I mean, I have a little difficulty actually debating this bill, to be honest with the folks listening, because I find this bill offensive and absurd in so many ways. It shocks me to my core that we are effectively undermining, I mean, I don't know, maybe thousands of years of, what is acceptable common law between free parties to engage in a time-limited rental agreement. And this is essentially throwing that away. How is I have a lot of questions that I didn't want to get to quite yet, because I kind of wanted to go into the bill, but I find myself compelled to stray into some of that territory, which is, since we're talking about it, what would be the proper way for the property owner to make a time-limited contract with a tenant?
I'm sorry. I need to clarify the question.
Well, so, Madam Chairman, I mean, the fact of the matter is that these lease agreements are time-limited now. They have a date they start and a date that they end. Okay, and we can talk about whether or not the terms are renewable or people want to engage in another one-year term or what have you. But the fact of the matter is, it is a time-limited contract with a beginning and an expiration. My question is, if you are a property owner and you do want to offer your property for rent, but you know that there is a point certain in the future where you intend to reclaim your property for whatever reason, because you want to give it to someone else or simply because you don't want to rent it anymore at that point, is there a mechanism for you to actually draft a contract where you put an expiration date if this bill passes?
It was my understanding that if you were going to take that apartment or whatever it is off the market, it's no longer available, that would be a reason to give someone as to why you would want the apartment back. I don't know about a begin and an end date for contracts, because they vary. We talked earlier about month to month, 6 months, 12 months. I don't know what the time frame is.
How about another scenario where a housing provider and a tenant communicate with each other and they make a mutual agreement where the housing provider says, well, I want to have this apartment available for someone I know on a certain date in the future, but I will rent it to you in the meantime, based on your understanding that you're going to leave, on the date that we put in the lease agreement. Is there a way to draft such a document if this bill passes?
Not that I know of.
Can I just ask if we see a problem with that?
Do I see an amendment coming?
You may.
I won't speak to that. I'll speak to what's in the bill.
Okay. So I'll just continue on with the language of the bill, and then we can maybe talk about some of these hypotheticals. And there are countless hypothetical situations that could come up. And I promise you, many that I have not considered that are going to happen in the real world, that are going to cause tremendous difficulty for citizens, for the people that we are supposed to be working on behalf of. And instead of allowing them the freedom to navigate those issues with one another by coming up with a mutual beneficial agreement that they parties sign and in good faith, we're going to use government force to interrupt their ability to engage in that type of agreement. And to me, it's inexplicable, and I don't see a reason for it. So starting on line 43, these are the reasons why a landlord can bring an action of summary process or other action to dispossess a tenant from their property. And before I go any further, I just want to talk about that for a quick second. I mean, you're changing what has customarily been a peaceful, voluntary respect for a written agreement where the tenant recognizes that the term of the lease has expired and vacates the premises voluntarily, and you are changing it into a requirement that the landlord has to engage in a lengthy and expensive process called an eviction. And I'll just point out, by the way, that the notion of referring to a non-renewal of a lease as an eviction is a falsehood. Okay, that's not what an eviction is. An eviction is something that is a legal process where a property owner has no choice but to involve the court system to remove a tenant that will not leave. That's what an eviction is. The non-renewal of a lease is, hey, we made a deal for this period of time and I don't want to renew it under the, for whatever reason. That's a totally different concept. And to try and equate those things, I think is not fair to anyone. It's not fair to anyone as far as just common sense goes. I printed out an Office of Legislative Research report right here. It's a few pages long about the eviction process in Connecticut. And of course, I thankfully I've never had to actually evict someone. I've always been able to work out any concerns with my tenants. I've always had a good relationship with the people that I work with, and we managed to come up with solutions to problems ourselves without the government getting involved or having to go to court. This is going to involve the court, and there will be many more unnecessary evictions as a result. But I just want to make sure people understand what you're asking here, which is that the landlord now has to go to court to remove their tenant because their lease expired and they didn't want to renew it. Now that's going to require the same process to remove someone who doesn't pay their bill or damages the property or causes some sort of havoc that rightfully needs to be removed. We're going to equate those things now, that someone doesn't want to honor the date that they signed as the expiration of the date is the same thing as those things. And the landlord now has to go through that lengthy and expensive process. And in Connecticut, we've already made it so unbelievably unfair because the landlord's got nobody paying for their bills, their legal bills. They're going to have to pay for a sheriff. They're going to have to pay for a lawyer. They're going to have to pay for court costs. They're going to lose the rent for the time that this is going on. In Connecticut, tenants are giving legal counsel for free. Why we even have any kind of policy that tells parties that are equal to one another in the fact that they're signing an agreement voluntarily, that one side should get legal representation paid for by state taxpayers, including both those parties. The landlord's paying taxes, so is the tenant, for the purpose of paying for legal fees for their opponent. Only in a system where government has gone wild could that possibly happen. And we could talk for a while here. I mean, I don't know if anyone on the committee has been part of an eviction process, either having to evict one or being evicted, or they have friends or family members that have gone through this process on either side of it. But it's an ugly process. It's a combative, it's not what we want to encourage as a state government. What we ought to be trying to encourage is how people can get along, not how they can fight with one another. And not only have we reduced the understanding that your lease is up, it's time to go, to now you have to evict someone, we have limited the reasons for why that eviction can take place to a very few, very specific items that are enumerated in this subsection B, subsection 1 of section 1. And I'm going to go through them. The first one is non-payment of rent. And thank heavens that's there, that you still allow a landlord to evict a tenant because they don't pay the rent. It amazes me. I mean, what a generosity that this body sees fit to allow that to still happen. Section B says refusal to agree to a fair and equitable rent increase as described in subsection C of this section. This is where things get sticky in a hurry. Subsection C of this section reads, the rent of a tenant protected by this section may be increased only to the extent that such increase is fair and equitable based on the criteria set forth in section 7-148C. So, yeah, thank you. I appreciate the music in the background. So, I just happen to have section 7-148C handy, so we can talk about it. Forgive me, I've got a number of pages here. This is a little insight into just how difficult this process is for those of us in the minority, by the way. I mean, this language for this bill was drafted by the chairs and the nonpartisan attorneys without any input from the minority. I found out just yesterday, late in the afternoon, that we would be debating this bill today at 10 in the morning, and that we had to get our members to get together and have a conversation about what we were going to do about it and so forth. And if you read through one of these bills, and thankfully this bill's only 8 pages long, but you will see that it's complicated, because nothing is written in plain English. This refers to Section C, which refers to this other statute that's not even in the document. You got to go look that up to see what that one says. And then in that statute, it's referring to 7 other statutes. So to really find out what's going on here, it gets complicated in a hurry. And I think that there's many things that were overlooked in this drafting of this legislation, because I think I read it more thoroughly than anyone who put the effort into drafting the document to get to the bottom line. And we're going to talk about some of those things. But that's the first thing that ends up being a problem, is that the second item is refusal to agree to a fair and equitable rent increase. Let's just talk about that for 1 second, which is fair and equitable to who? Where I come from, the things that we own, we get to set the price on. I don't care what it is. I don't care if it's your grandfather's watch or your car or your home or how much you want to charge for rent. That stuff, if it belongs to you, you should set the price. Period. End of story. I don't think anyone else has the right to set the price of things that belong to you. If I walked up to anybody in this room and said to you, what's the most important thing that you own? And then I decide to tell you that I want to, that you must sell it for half of that value that you've placed on it, I don't think you'd be very happy. And effectively, that's what this law does. This law tells the property owner that they no longer get to be the determiner of what they want to charge. And keep in mind that that's the way it was for a long, long time, when we actually lived under freedom and we relied on the marketplace to fix our problems. Things were better then, by the way, and I can talk to a great degree about that. But if you were a landlord or any other business selling cars or houses or anything, and you charged more than your competitors for something of less value, then guess what? You didn't have any business. People didn't buy your stuff. This works for employment too. If you are a business and you're not willing to pay quality employees to work for your company to perform a certain task, and someone else down the street was, well, guess what? You were going to lose your employees to them. That's how markets work. And our market works very well in this country. I mean, we're the recipients of the greatest quality of life of any human beings who have ever lived, because we're in America right this minute in 2024. And that's all due to that free commerce based on free market capitalism. And I'm be willing to debate anyone, even folks who want to make outbursts in the room, to challenge me on showing me how one place or one time that socialism, Marxism, or communism has worked better than the free market, because it never has. And we're gonna get into that conversation soon enough. But I want to leave item number B as the refusal to agree to a fair and equitable rent increase is already a problematic statement, because I believe that it infringes on the rights of the property owner in an extraordinary way. And in fact, I believe it rises to the level of what's called a taking in constitutional law for both state and the U.S. Constitution, by depriving the property owner of the full value of their property. It's what's called a constructive taking. And it gets worse, ladies and gentlemen, because the sentence goes on to say, described in Section C of this section. And if you go to Section C, as I mentioned, that points you to Section 7-148C of our state statutes, which is the statute that governs fair rent commissions. And this it was the subject of a significant topic that we debated in the Senate a couple of years ago. We had a very lengthy debate on the subject. But unfortunately, the fair rent commissions were expanded into many, many communities across the state. And currently, they now exist in all municipalities that have at least 25,000 as a population. It's worth noting that they do not exist in places where there is not a population of 25,000. So I wonder, Madam Chairman, if the item B is dependent upon the determination of a fair and equitable rent increase based on the Fair Rent Commission statute, who on earth is responsible for determining whether it's fair and equitable in a jurisdiction where there is no Fair Rent Commission?
Well, the law is already established on what is fair and equitable. That's established. In the place where when you want to take this beyond a Fair Rent Commission, if there's not one, it's actually on line 72, that they can bring action in Superior Court, determine whether a rent increase is fair and equitable based on the criteria set forth in 7-14(8).
I appreciate that, and I thank you for the answer. I am aware of the paragraph that you're referring to. You said that what is fair and equitable is established. Can you tell me how that is, Madam Chairman?
It is established under that 7-14(8) statute. Do you want me to read the statute?
I have the statute. I have the statute in front of me, and I would argue that it's not determined. I mean, determined is a word that implies that there is some answer to a question. Like, what is the answer to 2 + 2 = 4? Well, we've determined that the answer is 4. Okay, but in this particular statute, nothing is determined because it's utterly and completely arbitrary. The fact of the matter is, it implies that a determination of what is fair, or in this term, excessive, they don't even actually determine what is fair and equitable. So, I mean, that's problem one, is that there is no definition for fair and equitable. It's a definition of what is excessive. And the definition of excessive is insane. I mean, for lack of a better term. It takes into consideration things that have no reasonable place in any system or structure of laws, whether it's common law or in the United States or in the state of Connecticut or anywhere else. Because the value of a rent or a rent increase should not be determined on some of these factors. And I'll use some of these as examples. The amount of taxes and overhead expenses, including the debt service thereof. So we're trying to say that the amount that a rent increase should or should not be must have something to do with the expenditures of the property owner. But one thing has nothing to do with another. You could come into possession to any kind of property, whether it's a small item or a large item. You might have bought the right Beanie Babies in the 1980s for pennies on the dollar, and they're worth a fortune now. Would it be right to tell someone that has those items that they're not worth as much because you only paid a small amount for them? No, that's ridiculous. The fact of the matter is that things in the marketplace change in value. Is it right to tell someone who bought, Microsoft stock, way back when, or Apple stock, way back when, that when it was, for mere pennies, that it's not, you can't sell it for the, fortune that it's worth now? No, that would be ridiculous. And there's no reason why the expenses incurred by the property owner should factor into the value. The only thing that should determine the value is the owner himself and the tenant and what the tenant is willing to pay. That is what determines the actual value. Now, you can say that there's a market value to things, but even the market value is not determined by what the expenses of the property owner are. That makes zero sense, and that is crummy law that should not exist. And that's not even the worst of it, ladies and gentlemen. Item number 9 in this statute says the income of the petitioner. The income of the petitioner. So effectively, this, in our current statutes adopted with the Fair Rent Commission bill several years ago, they made it so the determination of whether a rent is excessive is based on how much money the tenant has. Nowhere, anywhere in our entire system of commerce in America can I think of another place where the amount that you can pay for something has to do with how much money you have. When you show up at Burger King and you order a number 5, they want their $13.50 or whatever ridiculous amount it is now. They don't care, how much money's in your pocket. They're not changing that for you. They're not saying, well, you're a rich guy, I'm going to charge you $113, or you're poor, I'm going to charge you $3. No, the value of the thing is the value of the thing. This term, this income of the petitioner language comes to us from a famous person. Maybe I might say infamous person in history. That's Karl Marx. He's the guy who came up with this concept. The idea that we should take from those who have to give to those who need. Now, that's a very nice ideological view, except it forgets every other important thing that we rely on in our world, in society, to function. Like, who deserves things? It's not just people who need things that deserve them. It's people that work for things that deserve them also. Any teacher, especially a teacher of small children, will tell you that even kids get this. When you have treats at the end of class for something, and the teacher's giving them out, the kids will call into question anything that they perceive as unfair about the way they're distributed or awards are distributed, because they fully recognize that if one child achieves some goal or behaves properly, they're the ones that actually deserve the treat. And other folks that don't produce and engage, or they misbehave, they don't deserve it. I mean, so that's something that is completely obvious to children, and it should be obvious to every one of us, but it wasn't obvious to Karl Marx, and it obviously wasn't obvious to the people that voted for this bill that created that language that is incorporated into the policy that we are debating today. And on those grounds at all, by itself, the fact of the matter is we shouldn't be supporting the legislation that is before us, because, as was mentioned, in the case of the debt or expenses of the landlord, the amount of money that the tenant applicant has is also irrelevant when it comes to the value of the property. That is an un-American and a communist notion, and it has no place in our Connecticut statutes. So that was number 2 on the reasons that you have to evict someone, even though they have failed to honor their own commitment to the expiration date of a lease. The first one was non-payment of rent. Perfectly reasonable. This one was refusal to agree to a rent increase that is determined by these crazy, insane parameters. Number C, or rather letter C, says material noncompliance with 47A11 or Section B of 2182. And I printed these as well. These seem to be relatively straightforward requirements for tenants as far as complying with, safety and peaceful activities. And that makes perfect sense, too. Letter D, forgive me, I did not bring my cheater glasses today, and I'm struggling a little bit. The material noncompliance section that I just mentioned. Oh, look at that. Thank you. My question is, who decides if these violations actually occurred? Can you show me where there is a mechanism between the tenant and the landlord to determine whether or not the tenant has not complied with either of those 2 sections? Through you, Madam Chairman.
I see nothing in the legislation that speaks of proof.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. That's precisely my point. The fact of the matter is that the property owner has nothing to lean on. They can make a claim all day long, but the fact of the matter is I don't know how they're going to avoid the eviction process and having to go through a court battle that is going to be expensive and with very little chance to succeed. Because they would have to provide documentation. Even on the subject of a tenant being a nuisance to other tenants or something like that, you can say, well, we put that in there, Senator. That's in there. They can evict the tenant for that. Well, except that how do you go about proving that? Or do you have to go ask for other tenants to sign an affidavit? Who's going to do all this? Who's going to pay for all that? And what does the property owner do in the meantime? Who's covering their expenses during this period where maybe they're not receiving any rent or can't rent their place to someone else because the person refuses to leave? Just moving on. D is voiding the rental agreement by material noncompliance with the agreement itself. E is material noncompliance with the rules and regulations the landlord adopted in accordance with a couple of other sections, which we could get into. But I want to talk about F and G really quick. F says that you can evict, again, not ask someone to leave, you have to evict based on F, which is permanent removal by the landlord of the dwelling unit of such tenant from the housing market. Can I ask, Madam Chairman, what is permanent?
I don't think the word permanent changes for anyone. It's for everlasting.
So if permanent is everlasting, that would mean that if I was a property owner and I decided I wanted to take my property off the market for rent for 20 years because I needed to use it for some other purpose, that would not qualify. Is that your reading of the bill, Madam Chairman?
Yes.
Do you... I'll ask this question again because we're all going to vote on this. Do you see a problem with that? Do you see that might be somehow unfair to the property owner?
I'm not here for fair or unfair. I'm looking at this as a way to address people being asked to leave a property without a reason.
Well, respectfully, Madam Chairman, we are here for fair and unfair. I mean, all I heard during the entire public hearing is about how this was done unfairly. It's only fair if, and this is supposed to be drafted in a way that we have to make a decision whether we're going to support the bill or not. Some of us are going to vote yes. Some of us will vote no. And we're going to clearly make that decision on whether we think this bill is fair to the parties that are involved. And I'll say that's completely and utterly unfair. I mean, if you wanted to set some sort of time frame, I think the whole thing is ridiculous. I think, and I'll keep repeating this, both parties signed an agreement with an expiration date. That's the end of the conversation for me. There is no further conversation necessary in a world that relies on common sense and goodwill to operate. But since we're down that road and you've got these provisions in here, to say permanent removal of the landlord of the dwelling unit from the housing market is just a ridiculous thing. What if I decided I wanted to use my building for some other purpose? Maybe somebody came to me and gave me the opportunity to say, look, I'm going to pay you twice what you're getting rent for your house if I could just use it as a storage facility for something else. I might say, yeah, well, how long do you want it for? 20 years. Okay, I'm going to do it. But then 5 years later, this person decides that they're out of that business because they're not making it. Can I go and put the property back on the market then, even though I used permanent removal of the housing market as my reason?
I'm not sure, but I believe permanent removal by the landlord is existing language. It's not new language.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairman. It's existing statute, but not in this context. Again, this context only existed for a very, very small, minute, in fact, percentage of the renting population. People that meet the qualifications that are being removed in this bill in Section A, subsection A1 of Section 1 on the first page of the bill, lines 4 through 15. So it's not in the same context. This is in every case whatsoever. Any landlord has got to go and evict his tenant. One of the reasons he's allowed to use is permanent removal, not simply removal, not removal for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. None of those things are adequate. It has to be permanent. What was the term you used? Everlasting. That's right. Okay. And so I'll just go on to the next one, which is G. And that is a bona fide intention by the landlord to use such dwelling as his or as such landlord's principal residence. So, again, a million questions. I mean, I don't know how these bills get written. What is bona fide intention? Okay, I can get that that's legitimate intention, but who decides whether it's bona fide or not? Through you, Madam President.
So on this, the landlord would be moving in, so that would be proof, right? That if he's asked someone to leave the premise because they plan on making it their principal residence, that would be evidence. Now, who's checking or who's investigating? I would, if it were me, and you asked me to leave for no reason, or you told me because you're taking it over, I, as the person who's been asked to leave, would be following up to find out, did you really move into that? But that is not written law. I'm saying to you that there's nothing here that says there's any type of follow-up to make sure, I don't see it, anything to make sure that that person has moved into, the landlord has moved into the premise.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. So I just want to understand this correctly. You're suggesting that if someone was asked to leave a apartment as of the expiration date of the lease that they agreed to, based on the property owner telling them that they wanted to move into the property, you would suggest that they follow up by tracking to make sure that's true?
I don't suggest it. I said if it were me and I didn't want to leave and I didn't get a reason to leave, that I would be.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And what would you do if you found out that that person had not moved in the next day?
I believe I would file a complaint with the court systems if there was not a rent commission.
Understood. Let me ask you this. Unlike the previous item 4, which is permanent, everlasting, this one just says intention, bona fide intention, right? Okay, so we were on one end, we're like, it's got to be permanent, everlasting, concrete, no way to get around it. And this one is, I got to have a intention to make this my residence. So what good is it to go and find out if that person actually moved in or not? If they didn't, but it was still their intention, I think it still satisfies the language of the bill before us. Is that correct, Madam Chairman?
Yes. So if they intended, are you asking if they intended to do it and then they didn't?
I don't think it says they have to at all. It only says
It's intention. Intention is intention. Goodwill. They planned on moving into the apartment. There's no recourse here for someone who has good intention and then doesn't follow through.
Okay. I don't know if it says anything about good intention. I don't think it says anything about actually moving it. It just says the requirement is a legitimate intention. Well, I suppose that's good intention. I'll backtrack on that. Okay, so there is nothing in here that suggests that they have to move into this residence for any period of time, is there?
No.
All right, thank you, Madam Chairman. So I appreciate that. So at least, I mean, I think that's important for people on the street to understand that if they simply indicate that they have an intention of using this as their residence, principal residence, that they could, in fact, ask a tenant to leave as of the renewal. But they'd still, you know, according to this language, may be forced with having to go through a lengthy eviction process. Lines 62 through 64 say a tenant may not be dispossessed for a reason described in several of the items that I just mentioned during the term of any existing rental agreement. Can I just ask, what is the term of the rental agreement?
I believe their term is whatever they have for an existing lease.
Are you referring to the beginning and expiration dates of the lease?
Yes.
Can I just ask, how do you think this is going to play out, Madam Chairman, in the future, if this law passes and effectively expiration dates are irrelevant, because now the tenant can stay indefinitely, except for one of these very specific reasons? Do you think that leases are going to be continued to be drafted in 1-year increments, as is commonplace?
You know, I've never dealt with the lease, so I really couldn't speak to what is going to happen in the future. But I will speak to what I heard in the way of testimony of people being asked to leave properties for reasons other than anything that we've heard in any of the reasons, and sometimes not given even a fair chance to speak with the landlord to know why they're asked to be moved.
Forgive me, Madam Chairman. I got distracted. I was trying to read the next section for my question. Can you repeat that?
What I said is I don't know. I've not engaged in leases with anyone, so I can't predict what would happen. But I do know that we may be protecting people who are asked to leave a place where they've lived for a while without a good reason. And based on the testimony we heard from people, there were various reasons that didn't fit within anything that we've mentioned earlier.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Yeah, no, I remember the testimony very well. Is it, again, the position of the chair that the mere agreement to an expiration date is not a good enough reason to indicate that that is the time for the tenant to go?
Yes.
Thank you. I appreciate you being so forthright on the record. We did hear a lot of testimony, and I mean, it sounded like my personal experience. I mean, you know, obviously there are good landlords, there are bad landlords, there's good tenants, there's bad tenants. I mean, this is the world we live in. You know that you know, not everybody is going to live up to the same standard and so forth. But for me, this bill proposal that's before us is extremely aggressive. It's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Is the expression. You're going to go ahead and cause a tremendous hardship for property owners, first and foremost. I want to get to the tenants and how they're going to be impacted by this in the conversation as it goes. But I mean, the immediate thing that's undeniable is you're going to be making a significant impact on perfectly decent and honest property owners who are trying to be fair with their tenants and simply run a business and survive. I almost feels like this bill is less about this interaction between landlords and tenants and trying to solve a legitimate on the ground problem with what happens and a shortage of housing and more about some sort of social justice effort or something like that. And that's fine if it is, but we should be clear about that, because I don't think that this is a solution to a real problem. There are solutions, though, and we should explore them to make sure that there are ways for people to have access to housing that is safe and affordable. And I want to. That's why I'm on the housing committee, because I want to do that. I want to work to make sure that there's more safe and affordable housing, and that that people not only benefit from housing as a place to live, but that housing is something that drives American success for people, of all backgrounds and all income levels. So that's why I'm here. It's frustrating because I believe that this is just a very dangerous bill that's going to impact a marketplace that is already shaky. I highlighted some of these other notes throughout the language of the bill. I know that the next section after this, line 68 through 75, has to do with, if there is no such fair rent commission, the next action is to go to Superior Court. But this would mean that the tenant is going to have to, file some court fees and so forth, as opposed to a fair rent commission. And I would just point out, from a tenant's perspective, if you're a tenant in a small town that doesn't have a rent commission, you're actually negatively impacted by this language, in that you don't have the same rights as somebody that lives in a larger town. You don't have the same access as someone in a larger town. And I don't like the fair rent commissions. I don't think that they serve a proper purpose based on the statute that was written. If you wanted to have a commission that effectively meant that the terms of the contract could be protected and adequately enforced for both parties, that is a laudable endeavor. That is something that should be done. People need consumer protections. They need to know that when they make a contract or they purchase something, that they get what they paid for and they deserve it. And we need some way to hold landlords accountable that don't maintain their buildings and all that. I'm all for all of that, and that's the kind of commission we should have. But instead, what was created is a political organization that imposes Marxism into the housing market via fair rent commissions and the statute that's there. That's not fair to anyone. But I'll just point out that this section effectively is making people that are tenants in small towns where there are no fair rent commissions go through a much more expensive process for the same result. The next section, 76 through 82, is bracketed out. This is removing the former protections, since they now are expanded to all tenants and tenant applicants. Lines 83 through 89 is about mobile home parks are going to be required to issue some sort of written notice about the provisions that are in this bill. They have to tell them their unit owners that they have these protections under law. Madam Chairman, is it common to write statutes that require private citizens to inform other private citizens of the law?
This is my second year in housing, but I've been in other committees, And it's not unusual to try to get something in writing that communicates between the tenant and the landlord, in my experience.
Well, I agree. I mean, the fact of the matter is, I mean, all of your correspondence, if you're a smart business person, whether you're a tenant or a housing provider, you should be making your correspondence in writing. That's not what I asked, though. I'm asking about whether or not it's common to tell one private citizen, hey, Bob, you have to tell David, what the law is. He needs to tell you that the speeding limit's 55 or whatever. I just don't know that that's common. Do you?
What would you say? How would you describe common?
Another example.
Excuse me?
Another example.
I don't have it for you. Sorry.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I appreciate that. Okay, so moving on. There's a few more sections to this bill. I don't know that we need to go through them. A lot of it is conforming changes. I'm just making sure there's nothing else substantive that I want to talk about before I get on with my soapbox about the bill instead. And I definitely do want to get on my soapbox about this bill. I mentioned right out of the gate that I thought this is one of the worst pieces of legislation that I've seen. I've been here 14 years, and I've worked on a lot of different proposals. And, there's a lot of things I agree with, and more than happy to work with my colleagues on. In fact, I mean, I think a little known fact is that somewhere around 75% of all legislation passes the Connecticut General Assembly unanimously. I mean, it's pretty amazing. So we do work on a lot of things together, but clearly there are some items where we're not going to get along and we're not going to see eye to eye. And those are the things where, our ideologies clash. And I've already expressed that I think that this is a bill that is symbolic of where I think the progressive Democrat Party leans, which is, government is the answer to a lot of problems, versus where me and Republicans tend to lean, which is that we want less government intervention in the lives of citizens, and that there's ways to resolve these things. So, and this bill is a pretty good example of that. It is an understatement. Most of the time, these things happen in a somewhat incremental way. And I can, get angry. I can vote against these policies when I see them slowly but surely encroaching into different areas of life. But this is a giant leap. This is not a incremental encroachment. This is a massive, giant leap. Basically upending contracts, upending private property rights, upending, the way landlords and tenants have interacted with one another since the beginning of time, and in almost every corner of the world. There are rental agreements, and in almost every corner of the world, going back centuries, those rental agreements were time limited. I mean, it's just common sense. Hey, I need to rent your space. Okay, I'll rent it to you. Well, how much do you want? I want this. And how long is that price good for? Okay, 6 months. Okay, good. Let's shake on it. That's where we began. And as time has gone on, we've only solidified the significance and concrete details of these agreements as an effort to protect the parties. The reason why we put it in writing, the reason why it has an expiration date, is to make sure both parties know what they're getting. So no one's taking advantage of the other side. And if there is a dispute, you can walk into a courtroom or with a mediator and say, this is what the agreement says, that's what I agreed to, and that's what I expect to happen, and the other person didn't live up to it, et cetera, et cetera. And you can argue it out. But it solves problems. It solves disputes to have this in writing. When you go ahead and say, well, that agreement doesn't mean anything, we're going to pass a law. First off, I don't think the state has a right, first off, to pass a law interfering with what two private citizens decide between them. They don't need us. They don't need this building. They don't need the people in this community to tell them how to handle this transaction. They can do it on their own. They're free people, mind you. Free people. And free people have the power to do all kinds of things. That's what separates us from the rest of the world, is that people here have the right to own property. And therefore, they should be able to do what they want with that property. And this bill is completely and utterly undermining both of those concerns, contracts and property rights. Madam Chairman, I have some basic questions I just want to get on the record for the purpose of building a strong case. God forbid this ever goes to court. Who, in your mind, is impacted by this legislation? What segment of society?
I don't have the actual data, but based on the testimony that we received earlier in the week, it's low-income people, it's people of color. That is my observation from what we heard.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. So is the purpose of this legislation to somehow create equity for people of color?
Well, not just for people of color, for anybody who's been disenfranchised by the systems, and giving them a voice. You're saying it's freedom versus force. I'm saying it's trying to create something that's equitable, right? Maybe not fair the way you describe fair, because you did not hear me use the word fair in my speaking, but I believe in equity.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. You brought up the fact that this bill impacts people with low incomes and minorities. I didn't. And I think it's actually very interesting because we heard testimony on this bill and also on the other bill on our agenda about the collateral consequences from a number of tenants and landlords from all strata of life and different income levels and so forth. Because I think this bill is going to impact far more people in far more ways than might be readily apparent from our simple conversation about the text of the bill. And that's why I asked, because I do believe that this is going to impact a lot of people. Is it the intention of this bill simply to provide an equitable result for a portion of the population?
I would say yes.
Thank you very much for that answer. I respect that that's where you're coming at this from. I just don't think that is the proper use of government. I think our job here is to protect the rights of all of our constituents. It is not to advance certain groups or separate them out by giving them different set of opportunities or rights. All people deserve to be treated equally. Anyway, how about commercial property? Is commercial property affected by this legislation?
Commercial properties are not in this legislation.
I understand that commercial property is not contemplated in the actual text of the bill, but is it impacted by this bill? What do you think that the availability, the cost, or any other concerns about commercial property might be impacted once this is passed?
Only if we start doing more development on commercial properties that lie vacant.
Understood. That's certainly the case, but I also think that you may see certain types of residential property become commercial property because I think that property owners are going to be measuring the impact of this legislation, and they're going to be deciding, well, the commercial property market is not nearly as regulated by the state. Doesn't have the same harsh impediments imposed on property providers in the residential realm. It's different, so commercial might be the way to go for some people. They might say, you know what, I'm going to take my 3-family house and I'm going to go down to town hall and I'm going to beg them to turn it into a mixed-use building so I don't have to worry about this law. And I really do think that's going to happen. How about condominiums, Madam Chairman? Are they impacted?
Common interest communities? Yes.
In what way?
They fall under this giving cause.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I think that you're right in the sense that rental condominium units would definitely be impacted, but actual unit owners are not explicitly addressed in the bill. But I do see the potential, and the reason why I ask is because I do see the potential for some apartment buildings to become condos as a result of this, because that's another way that the market will react to significant regulatory policy interrupting the ability for commerce in residential real estate. Do you see what I'm talking about?
I hear you.
You hear me?
I hear you.
All right. Good. I'm glad we hear each other. I mean, that's important. That's what, it's always, a regret of mine that we don't actually engage in more real debate. I mean, I like the fact that we can challenge each other on different views and questions. And I think people benefit from hearing that. That's why Representative Butler and I before we should have let that, we'd be still talking, I bet. And it would be good.
I don't want to take away from your time, so
Yes.
I want to hear it.
Understood. It's all pure respect, though, and I want to just state as a quick aside that I feel very fortunate to serve with you, Madam Chairman. I think we have diametrically opposed views on some things. I mean, we really do, but I like you. I think you're a good person, and I respect you, and I feel like I get that same respect in return, and that's what's important. And I think that's a good example for people on the street. That you can disagree. This is the beauty of living in a free country, that we can have different views and say, yeah, well, they're entitled to their opinion. I don't agree, but I can see where they're coming from. So thank you for that, Madam Chairman. How about corporate landlords? There was some conversation on another bill today about absentee landlords. How are they impacted in this particular legislation?
I think a landlord is a landlord, and I don't think it matters if they're corporate or not.
I love that you said that. I appreciate that, because a lot of the testimony that we heard was, blaming out-of-state landlords. And I'm like, look, maybe there is a situation where some out-of-state landlords are bad landlords, and that I'm not denying that. But just to say that they're a bad landlord because they're out of state, I think that's going down a very dangerous road. That is discrimination, based on superficial characteristics. We don't approve of discriminating against people based on their gender or their race or their religion, because these are superficial things. Just because somebody has some characteristic doesn't make them good or bad. And we got to get past all that. I mean, we really do. We got to start remembering we're the human race, and that, people should be respected and treated the same. And I don't want to say that every out-of-state landlord is a bad landlord. And I don't like it when I hear it from anyone. And I sometimes hear it even from my own colleagues, and I don't like to hear that either. They should make a distinction about, well, these are bad landlords and these are good landlords, but not every person that fits another category is going to end up being good or bad. And the same thing goes for tenants too. I mean, and we're going to talk about that much more when we get to the collateral consequences bill, because I think that's the difficulty there, is that you're talking about making a determination of who is a good tenant or not. And that is a very hard question to answer when you don't know someone personally. Madam Chairman, do we have a housing shortage?
According to all the reports in the last 2 years, I believe we do, and I believe it's real.
Yes, ma'am. And how do you define a housing shortage? I mean, are you defining that as the way I did earlier, that there's just not available housing, or that there's no housing at all?
Well, considering that we haven't really done a lot of development in housing since the 80s, we fall short. I don't think we'll ever have enough housing for everyone, right? But the availability of more housing is needed. And I don't know, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but until we start to address it, the number is going to continue to grow.
Understood. Whenever maybe I'm deep, maybe that's my problem, Madam Chairman. I'm just deep. But whenever I get a bill in front of me and I want to look at it, I start asking myself like really basic questions. I want to just pull back and make sure I'm not just, running with some sort of preconceived assumption or something that I heard or something like that. And because to me, I mean, the only evidence that I have that there is a housing shortage is a lot of rhetoric and news reports. And occasionally when I do list a rental, I get a little bit more activity than I have in the past. But I'll tell you, I have a rental listing right now that is competitively priced, and it's been on the market for 3 weeks, and it still isn't taken. So I mean, is there an extreme shortage of rental units? I don't know. Is it going to be in some geographical locations there's more of a shortage than others? Is it in some sub $1,000 a month rentals? There might be a really big shortage with inflation and all. So all that's probably true. But Madam Chairman, of course.
I just want to respond to that. I've been looking for a one-bedroom in West Haven for 2 weeks. Now, part of the reason I can't find anything is because they're all over $2,000. So some of it has to do with price. And then some of the other locations that I did find, it's not someplace where I think it's safe for anybody to live. So I think there's many reasons why some properties sit. I don't know why yours is sitting. I hope it's a good piece of property in a good neighborhood and with a good landlord, I hope. But everybody is not a good landlord. And you're right, there are some bad actors. And part of the reasons that we're here today is because we have to protect people. In my opinion, that I need to be able to protect people who have to deal with bad landlords, who don't have the wherewithal, who don't know their rights, right? And something else that you said is about building. We are building on what we did in the last session and some of the things that we didn't go through. And I think why would you need elected officials if we didn't have a job to do to protect people and to help them? I think that's part of our responsibility.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, but when I say protect our constituents, I mean protecting their civil liberties and protecting their rights. I don't mean taking from one of my constituents to give to a different constituent. And that, I am afraid, is more what happens in government than not. Is there any data about the housing shortage that you could share that might tell us a little bit more about geographical locations where we need more or anything like that?
Certainly. So Connecticut Partnership for Strong Communities had a great report. Home Builders Association, which I'm published in, by the way, had a great report. There are several articles that you could Google and with real data and can specify where there are availability of properties and where there's a shortage. So it's there. It's available for us.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. So what is the number one reason that you would put on why we have a housing shortage?
The lack of development in the last 40 years.
That would imply that somehow the available supply of residential housing has declined or the population has increased. Do you have any data on either one of those things?
The only data that I have that I can tell you specifically was in the Home Builders article that talked about our lack of building affordable housing or any type of housing. I know in some places that I've watched really large mansions be built and smaller properties where it might have been 2 houses built on a lot, purchasing both the lots and building one larger mansion. And that's just some of the things that I've heard and that I've read.
Understood. Yeah, no, I've been looking at this too and trying to wrap my head around, whether we really do have a shortage of existing structures. I mean, I want to separate that from whether or not they actually count as housing or not. I mean, do the buildings exist? Do we have these people here and we have some buildings. Putting them together requires more than just having those two things. We need to have, willing participants in rental agreements, and we need to have them scaled for the needs of the tenants and affordability, and I guess that's what needs to be fixed more than anything. But I think that those factors are contingent on many other things, and it's difficult for us as just the housing committee to start to discuss what's affordable or not, or to make policy that impacts the price of housing anywhere, because there's so many factors. I mean, mortgage interest rates are higher than they have been in recent years. Inflation is out there affecting the cost of everything. I mean, literally everything. I mean, gasoline's 50% more than it was a couple of years ago. The cost of groceries is off the chart. I can't even believe it. I barely cover the bottom of the cart, and it's $50, for it's like there's 4 things in my cart. It's hard to believe how much stuff it costs these days, and I don't know if that's going to get better. Madam Chairman, I'm going to put you on the spot, and I'm going to ask you if you think that the actions of state government have led to that rise in costs for everything, particularly housing.
I think federal government has had some play in it. I think we all have to take responsibility for what people are experiencing, all of us. I don't use the word never and always very frequently, but I think we all have to take responsibility as legislators for what's taking place. Not just this group of legislators, but past. It is our responsibility to make this United States better than what it is all the time, improve on it, build a standard. And I think we've dropped the ball in many places. And I just want to speak back to the housing. I live in a one-family house by myself. I'd love to sell that house and go live in a condominium, right? But if I can't, I'm not going to sell my house and with another mortgage for a lot of money to go in a condominium that I can't afford, not at this age. So if I can't move out of my house, then I can't make way for a small family. I just have a 3-bedroom. I can't make way for another family to come in and take the house, right? Or move into the house and let me move. So we're not even seeing that happen where people can afford because of the interest rates, because of the availability, and all the other things that have increased in inflation. We're stuck. We're stuck. So I want a nice condominium that I can afford, one level, but it's just not available.
I know a good realtor, Madam Chairman. So I will definitely keep it in mind. And I know that there's real issues out there and problems that need to be solved. I guess our differences really rely on whether or not we think it's the role of government to solve some of these problems. And I won't take responsibility for what's going on. I'm sorry to say. I do my best to vote against agenda items and policies, notably our most recent state budget. I voted no. It was a significant increase in state spending, 9%, that is passed on to consumers of all different levels. I know there's, discussion about a really tiny income tax cut that was in there, but it's hard to justify a tiny income tax cut for a few people when the overall spending is increasing, multiple billions of dollars. That means we're all paying more taxes. And I just don't support that. I also think, our state property taxes are an impediment to living in Connecticut, period. And if there's a single item that I think is driving up the cost of property and rents, it's property taxes impacting rents for sure. Because I know that for me, that is the number one I can't get rid of expense. You could pay off your mortgage potentially. You could do a lot of things to reduce your costs as a housing provider. But if the property taxes continue to go up, there's no way to get around that. And those costs are passed on to tenants. And tenants need to realize that too. I mean, when they're at the ballot box and they're voting for what their government looks like, they should recognize that anything that they do that is going to impact people that they interact with may be passed on to them. And I think that's true in for all of us. I wanted to get into a lot more in-depth discussion about the interaction of the state government, but I think that this bill speaks for itself. I have heard from literally dozens of property providers in the last several days as a result of the public hearing we had. And they're scared. I will tell you that people are going to change their direction, Madam Chairman. There are people that own rental property in the state, and they're prepared to make significant changes based on the policies that are happening in this committee right this minute. And I'll say it doesn't even have to pass. It doesn't even have to become law. I mean, the fact of the matter is that if you are a rental provider in Connecticut right now, you're watching this and you're scared of what could happen. And the very threat that this body meets every year and comes back with more and more regulatory and hostile legislation is sending a message. You know, we don't want any more rental providers in our state. We're going to make it the hardest place to do business in the whole country right here in Connecticut. So if you want to be in that business, you should leave. You should go someplace else. I mean, that's the message that this bill and this committee conveys regularly. And I'm being very blunt about it, Madam Chairman, because I want you to hear it, because I don't know if you're hearing from those same people that I am, but that's what they're telling me. And I will also let you know that I'm concerned as well. You know, my own personal business has become the subject of conversation in this committee, and certainly in several newspaper articles. I don't know if there's an effort to try and silence me in some way or make me out to be some rich person. I'm not rich. I promise you, I'm not rich. And I will tell you that being a landlord doesn't make you rich either. People go out of business regularly. The governor of this state, during the pandemic, basically told tenants not to pay their landlords. I know people that lost everything. They lost literally everything. I know someone who borrowed against the home that they live in, their single-family house, to buy a rental property. And during the pandemic, when their tenant stopped paying them, they couldn't pay their own mortgage. They ended up having their home foreclosed on. Their tenant was still fine living in the other property, but they were losing their place to live. So, I mean, to just have this very theoretical and stereotypical, and I'll even add discriminatory view that somehow landlords are rich. One of our colleagues used the term generational wealth. Well, I mean, no one gave me anything. I grew up in an inner city. I grew up in Meriden. My parents did own a home, but it was a very modest home. They didn't pass it down to me. And the fact of the matter is, people they make it. They work hard and they achieve things. And I also don't think we should be taking away from people just because they do have things or they were left things. I mean, that's not right either. When I was growing up, when we saw someone who had nice things, and I'll remember very vividly one of my classmates when I was in high school. I think he showed up in our senior year during the summer driving a brand new Mustang convertible. And I'm telling you, we were all jealous. We were like, man, that is a really, really sweet car. And but the feeling among me and my friends was like, this student, I won't even say his name, but we knew he worked hard. We knew he did. This is a guy who slaved away to make sure he earned the money to have that car, and we respected him for it. And we all said, kind of the same thing, which is, I'm going to work my butt off and I'm going to get, X, Y, Z. Today I worry that when people see other folks doing well, there is less desire to emulate hard work and achievement and more desire to tear those people down and say they don't deserve it. That was given to them. I don't want to get into like a bunch of, cruddy politics and people talking about things like white privilege and stuff like that. But I mean, that's what that is for me. That's all racism. That's all putting people into different boxes and categories. And that's all bad. It doesn't matter. It's been bad since the very first day that anyone judged anyone based on the color of their skin. That was wrong. The first day it happened, it's still wrong today, and it doesn't matter who's doing it to who. And I don't like to see legislation that goes down that road. And I worry that when we start to write policies like this, I think there is an element there of social justice based on the stereotype of the wealthy property owner and the disenfranchised, tenant. And I just, that's not entirely true. Now, it may be the case and it might happen often, but that's not every case. And when you write laws, you cannot be using assumptions and stereotypes. You got to be more fair than that. And the way we overcome these type of prejudices is to be just, to treat people fairly, and to write policy that is not going to impact different people in different ways. For me, the equality argument ends with the fact that both the landlord and the tenant sign a contract. And again, you can make arguments about how the tenant has got a more difficult position, and there's, it's the same argument I hear in the labor committee about the employer versus the employee. But at the end of the day, it's a voluntary agreement. No one is forcing anyone into it. And yes, people sometimes are in a bad situation and they have to take circumstances that they don't 100% agree with. But that happens to everyone. It literally happens to everyone at different points in their life. I don't, with few exceptions, I think other people always have situations where they don't get entirely what they want. Madam Chairman, does this bill respect the fact that a lease rental agreement is a private contract?
It does.
And if I said no, it doesn't, because the expiration date is a part of that contract and it's being ignored by this legislation, how would you respond?
I don't think it's being ignored. I think it's being considered, but also considering, you talk about equitable. The world that you describe on some of this, I have no idea where that world is. It's not the world I live in and what I've experienced in life. But I believe there needs to be a protection for both the tenant, who may be treated unfairly, and I also listened to what the owner said and how many people who owned really large properties, tenants, property owners who manage large property. I listened to what they said also. I think this is fair and equitable, and that's where I'll leave it. I do. I wouldn't, if I thought this was leaning more toward one, I wouldn't sit here with you and stand on it. I would just fold and say, I don't believe it. But it is what I believe is fair and equitable. And based on what I've heard from people, I believe it's fair and equitable.
I certainly acknowledge and respect that you believe that. I hope that I can get through to some of your colleagues, though, because I really don't see that this is fair and equitable in any way. There's no other example in our system where free citizens engage in commerce that the government takes such a strong weight on one side of the transaction to basically negate the written contract that both parties agree to, and that's what's happening here. Does it concern you that the mechanism for the termination of the rental agreement is no longer going to be the voluntary returning of the property owner's housing unit? It's going to end up in more cases with evictions. Does that concern you?
It doesn't concern me, but it does say to me that the tenant and the property owner both have a course of action. If that property owner believes that it was unfair, he has the same rights as the tenant to go to court with it.
I don't know what you mean by the same rights. I mean, there's no. It's not a right to have to go to court to evict someone from your property. I mean, is that what you're considering equal or equity and the rights of the landlord?
I would say he has the same opportunity as the tenant to pursue legal actions.
Well, I mean, and I appreciate that we're having the kind of back and forth, but I mean, I don't see how you can say that those things are equal. The tenant can leave if they want at the end of the lease. The lease ends. If they want to go, they will honor it, and they have no more obligation to the landlord at all because the contract expired, the terms are over with. They can go about their way freely, and they're not under any other obligation. But we're saying that the landlord is still under the obligation of those terms of the lease, and the only mechanism they have to get out of that is to go through a costly, expensive eviction where they're going to lose money. I mean, no matter what, even if they were completely justified in engaging in that, they're going to lose money. They're not going to get a free lawyer. They're not going to win court costs. They're not going to get anything. If they're lucky, they'll get their property back after they've lost revenue and paid all these lawyers' fees and courts fees. So, I mean, justify for me that these folks are on equal footing.
We mentioned what are the reasons that you could, the 13 reasons, right? What would be another reason that you would get rid of someone? Can you tell me what that other reason might be? So now, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you that question. Would that be okay? All right.
Yeah, Madam Chairman, I'm here asking the questions, but I'm prepared, so I don't mind. I can think of many examples. What if I wanted to rent my property to some personal friend of mine that is in need? There's nothing in this that would allow me to do that. My best friend in the world is down on their luck. They have a medical condition. They need a place to stay. I'm willing to rent my apartment that I'm getting $2,000 a month for. I want to give it to them for $500, which is my, the bare minimum I need to keep it going. Can I do that under this bill?
No, you can't. But you would put someone else in the same position as your friend by putting them out of a place that you've rented them to bring somebody else in. Because he's your friend. Not because
Well, I appreciate that, Madam Chairman, but again, this goes back to my property. Do you respect the right of someone to own their own property? I mean, do you own your own car? I mean, if I told you that I needed your car more than you do, are you going to give it to me?
Yes. Do you need it more than I do? Do you want it?
I mean, if that's a requirement for someone to be able to vote yes for this bill, I defy other people in the room to be able to do that. Maybe you're sincere. I'll take you at your word for it that you'd give me your car based on that. But I doubt most people would. And I don't equate, the idea that I would be giving this property to creating the same problem for someone else. That's not true, because that person was paying the rent at whatever the rate was. I just believe that, if it's your car or the landlord's house, ultimately they have the final say how it's used, and not someone else. What if you wanted to do renovations on the property to make it a nicer property because you want to charge more rent? I mean, we can get into the whole thing about the profit conversation we had, and I'm dying to have that chat, but that's a legitimate reason for a landlord to want to have a tenant leave at the end of their lease so that they can improve it and rent it to someone else at a higher amount. Or they simply want to make the house nicer because it is going to be worth more when they pass it on to their kids, or they sell it to finance their retirement. Would that be allowed under this bill?
Only if it's not in compliance regarding health and safety.
What if I decided I wanted to turn my 10-unit apartment building into condominiums? Because many of the tenants there have expressed a desire to purchase their units and convert it into a condominium association. Would I be able to remove the 1 out of 10 tenants who wants to stay there under the lease agreement beyond the date of its expiration that we both signed. I know I keep saying that, but I want to keep reminding people because both parties signed the agreement with the expiration date on it. No one's asking for something beyond that from the housing proprietor perspective.
It would be the permanent removal one. Sub F, line 55.
You gonna have me too?
Yes.
If you ask.
I'm just teasing.
Line 55, permanent removal by the landlord of the dwelling unit of such tenant from the housing market. Yes. Yes.
Thank you for that answer, but I go back to what is permanent. I mean, very few things on earth are permanent. I know everlasting. I mean, but at some point the moon's going to crash into the earth, and the earth's going to crash into the sun, and I mean, I don't know. At that point, there are no more apartments. So I mean, I don't know if you can say anything is permanent. Would you agree that a contract has certain parts, Madam Chairman, and among those parts would be the mutual acceptance of the parties to the contract?
I think you asked that before. I agreed to that.
And you feel that once somebody has signed a contract in writing that is binding on both parties?
I agree to that.
The one thing you have not agreed to is that the expiration date should be binding on both parties. And I'm wondering why that is an exception. Are there any other exceptions to what you might agree to in writing that should not be honored?
I have nothing else to offer.
Okay. One of the things that we didn't talk about is what really makes a contract is offer and acceptance. Okay, without having someone offer something and the other party accept it, you really don't have a contract. And I believe that this bill eliminates the fact that there's a contract in place. Because the moment the property owner is forbidden from making the offer that they choose because they have to accommodate the regulatory scheme that's laid out in this bill, there's no chance for acceptance. And I think that's a key ingredient here. And the other part of that offer and acceptance is the mutual consent. So if you're suggesting that we still have a contract, even though only one person is accepting the expiration date and the other person is not accepting that, but they're accepting some other interpretation of the contract created by this statute, you do not have mutual acceptance any longer. So I think that makes is an important point about determining whether or not there's still a rental agreement in place. I asked this question of somebody during the hearing. I said, so when does the agreement end? And that's a good question.
And what did they respond?
I don't know.
I don't have an answer for you on that. I would say it ended at the end of the termination of the written or verbal contract. That's it. I would say that's when it ended.
So you're suggesting that the contract still ends on that date. What is the mechanism by which the tenant would still be allowed to maintain and live in the property, and why would they be paying rent? Based on what?
First of all, let me step back a minute. If the contract ended on December 30th and the landlord was not going to renew it on January 1st, that he would have given notice that he's not renewing the contract, right? And then it would go into a discussion as to why you're asking me to leave, right? That's the discussion that would take place. Yep. You've mentioned it yourself that there are not a lot of, every landlord is not a bad landlord. A good landlord would be in a discussion with that person, that I'm asking you to leave. And that person, being the good landlord that he is, would disclose the reason of why he's asking him to leave. And that it would fall into one of these categories.
Well, I appreciate that answer, Madam Chairman. But you asked me a moment ago to list some circumstances that were legitimate that don't fall into those categories. For instance, I want to offer the property to another person that I know that is in need. So now we have a problem because I think that's still a good landlord. Or is it your opinion that that person's not a good landlord?
I would say that if you wanted to include that as one of the reasons, then we would write it into law.
So am I to take that offer as encouragement to bring many amendments to expand this bill into something that can be improved?
You make that amendment and let's close this down and vote on it. You got it.
I think that might be a helpful amendment, and you might just see it. But I don't think that that's going to get there all by itself.
There's a caveat to what I said, though, remember.
Yes. So let me ask you this. What about existing rental contracts? Does this just only apply to new rental contracts that go forward, or does this apply to existing rental agreements?
There's a date in here that line, I think it's line 83. It begins on, for all contracts starting January 1st, 2025.
Thank you for that, Madam Chairman. But I guess my question is, I understand the date that is in the legislation, but I guess the problem I'm having with all of this is, like, if the date doesn't matter any longer on the existing renewal rental agreement, and there is no actual expiration date because the tenant's going to be allowed to stay beyond that date, with only limited and very specific recourse from the landlord, is that is an existing agreement, or is that a new agreement? See, it says, because this says a rental agreement is entered into or renewed with a tenant, but effectively, if I have a contract that goes until after January 1st, 2025, but it expires, say, on February 1st, 2025, and I don't offer a renewal to my tenant, or I do, rather. If I offer one, is that actually a renewal? But if I tell them that I don't want them to, I'm not going to give them a lease, but they suggest that they're going to stay anyway, and I'm going to be in a position of evicting them, is that lease considered to be renewed? Is that an active rental agreement?
I believe it is. I think what I'm reading here is that a renewed contract is something that you're beginning again. It's not something that's existing.
Yeah, I would say that that's true under normal circumstances. But remember, I just had this conversation with you a moment ago about offer and acceptance. And the fact of the matter is that the landlord is not being given an opportunity to offer terms or accept terms. He's being told by this body via a state law that they have to accommodate the requirements. I won't drive you crazy. I mean, we've had enough conversation about the contract aspect of this thing. And I think I've laid the groundwork that I want to, which is to say that this is not a contract anymore. As soon as the state decides to pass this into law, the existing rental agreement ceases to exist. It's not a valid contract anymore. The state has undermined its existence because the dates, which are a key ingredient. I suspect that new lease agreements are unlikely to even have expiration dates. Because I asked this before, how would a landlord ever write a time-limited contract? And I don't see that there's a way to do that. The only way you could time limit your contract is if you could foresee one of the items that you're allowed to evict someone for. And effectively, that's not a time limited contract, because you're not doing that via offer and acceptance or mutual agreement. That means that you're being forced to give up your property because the state tells you to, until a condition occurs where you are allowed, by the generosity of the state, to have your own property back. Yeah, it's, I mean, I'll go back to, this is one of the worst bills I've ever seen. I asked some opinions of some attorneys who deal with real estate law yesterday, when I knew that this bill was coming, and asked them, I mean, is there a feasibility? This is the question I asked. I said, is it feasible to have a lease agreement that does not have any time limitations? And they told me no. And the answers that they gave me were that most legal systems don't allow indefinite leases, to provide both landlords and tenants predictability and flexibility to change terms and to predict what's going to happen. And this undermines those predictability and flexibility options. They also said that, circumstances change over time. Property values fluctuate. The needs of the tenant evolve. Maybe they want to move someplace else. They get a different job. They get married. Who knows? An eternal lease would not account for those changes. Property ownership. Properties do change hands. If I want to sell my property to someone, the way the law reads now is that if I have a piece of property with a tenant and I go to sell it, the new buyer has got to honor the contract, but only for the term of the contract. So now, I guess this is a question I will confirm with you, Madam Chairman. If a purchaser buys a property that has a tenant in it with an expiration date, 1-year lease, with a new property owner fall under this bill, will they be forced to keep this tenant on unless one of the exceptions comes into play where they can evict the tenant for cause?
I'm going to recess for a moment, all right?
Sure.
Yes.
The answer is yes. So that means that the person buying the property would be subject to the terms of this bill. So that would mean that if I was going to sell my property, I am going to be severely limited if this is a residential property that can be used in a different way than if I had the option. Or if the buyer had the option to reclaim the use of the property. They're going to be stuck having to use it for the purposes laid out in the bill. Again, I'll go back to the comments I made earlier about our constitutional protections in the U.S. Fourth Amendment, and I think it's the Eighth Amendment in the Connecticut Constitution about due process and the taking of private property, and that this is a constructive taking again. So I mean, lawyers, please hear me out there when you go to file a lawsuit to get rid of this law, that's a place you should go to. You should go to the fact that this is a taking. It also is a freedom of association issue. I was talking about the question and answer I had with some attorneys about whether or not a lease that lasts forever is feasible or not. And we covered legal constraints, changing circumstances, the ownership of the property, and what happens to a purchaser. But the other thing they mentioned was public policy. Perpetual leases could lead to inefficient land use, hinder development, and create unfair situations. And you can imagine lots of different things that could happen in those circumstances, as well as anyone can. Leases have fixed terms. That's just the way they've been done. And like I said, that's been going on since there was the first property and the first renter. having something that has no expiration date doesn't make any sense. I wrote down on my notes expiration versus eviction, because that's what we're talking about here. We're getting rid of a lease that expires on a certain day, and there is a desire for some to call it an eviction. It's not an eviction. It's an expiration, because the agreement was written and agreed to by both parties as having a certain deadline or expiration date. And to force one of the parties to have to go through the court system to end that agreement afterwards is unjust and unfair. And I know I asked this question before, but I have no doubt in my mind that this is going to lead to many, many more evictions. And needlessly so. It does not have to happen. This policy, I don't think, is going to benefit anyone. During the public hearing, I mentioned that, this is just how things are. A lease has an expiration date, just like when you go to the movies and the movie's over, it's time to go home. You don't stay and sit there through the next, movie or the next 5 movies or the next 5 months or years of movies. You don't. When you rent a car, you sign an agreement that says, I'm going to rent this car for a week, while I'm on a trip or something. And at the end of the week, I got to bring it back. The car belongs to the rental car company. It doesn't belong to the person renting it. And they need to return it. I mean, are we going to see legislation like that down the road where when you rent a car, it's up to you, you can keep it indefinitely, and the rental car company has nothing to say about it? What about other property type agreements? Madam Chairman, what about renting a hotel room, which is effective a very short-term lease? Does this impact hotels?
Hotels are not included in this legislation.
Thankfully. Is there a reason why we wouldn't include hotels? I mean, people, pay a rent for a period of time, just like they do with any other type of agreement. What makes that time-limited lease different than a typical rental agreement?
Well, do people take out leases to live in a hotel?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. It's just not included.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, you could be looking at this simply from somebody who's staying in a hotel temporarily for a day or two, but some people rent hotel rooms for years on end. I don't know if they're going to end up being captured by this legislation or not, depending on the terms of their agreement. I guess I don't know what is the determining factor of who ultimately falls in this agreement. Does it have to be it doesn't have to, I mean, clearly it could be a commercial property owner, so that could be a hotel. Yeah, so let me ask again, because I think we need an answer to this question. Will a hotel chain, and some of them that have relatively long-term extended stay, for example, they offer lengthy periods of rental to, effectively tenants. Would they be covered under this bill? Through you, Madam Chairman.
There's nothing in here that says anything about hotels or includes hotels. When you're saying that, I can't imagine low-income people being able to afford to stay in a hotel for an extended period at $200 a night. I wonder who that person, who would be that would be staying in a hotel, unless it was someone moving from a fire or something like that. So I don't know the condition, but I know it's not included in this bill.
Well, I appreciate that response, Madam Chairman, but the bill is not just about low-income people. And just so you know, people that have modest incomes often do rent hotels. I mean, there are some hotels in many towns across Connecticut that are cheaper than renting a apartment, or they're willing to work with you to come up with terms to make them reasonable to rent. So, I mean, that definitely does happen. And I know you said that you don't believe that that's covered under this, but I'm curious to know why. I mean, I don't know why a hotel would be different than a commercial landlord if you're talking about, I mean, what is the deciding factor that whether this bill applies or not? Is it that there's a rental agreement in place, or is it that there is a landowner and a tenant? I mean, what exactly decides whether or not this applies? Through you, Madam President.
So the legislation does speak of a rental agreement. It doesn't speak of commercial properties. It doesn't speak of hotels. So it's not included in this legislation. And I believe there is actually a description in statute on what a hotel is versus what we're doing in this bill in the way of apartments or a tenant. And I don't know, I'm telling you, I don't know that in a hotel that a person is considered a tenant. I don't know. It would be something I would have to look at.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I think that this is something that needs to be researched, though, which is that in the case of like an extended stay or a small independent hotel, and I can think of several, in my district, in fact, that I think have long-term tenants. They just work it out as if they're a landlord like any other landlord. So I don't know if they're going to get wrapped up in this or not. I already asked the question. I'm sorry that I'm kind of redundant about some of these things. It's just that it keeps coming up to me how nonsensical it is to have an agreement that doesn't have an end. It's just like I wrote a bunch of questions that we've already kind of answered. Like, can either party end the agreement? And the answer is the tenant has got the ability to end the agreement at any point after the expiration date of the lease. And are they? I don't believe they're have any stipulation or requirement. Madam Chairman, can either party end the agreement after the expiration date on the original rental agreement?
I believe. Are you speaking of the lease, the rental agreement? If there was an agreement, I believe they could. The renter, are you speaking of the rental or the? Excuse me,
Madam Chairman. Yeah, I'm trying to get to a secondary question, but the first one I asked is, can either party, the landlord or the tenant, end the agreement after the lease expiration? And you can. I mean, the answer is only the tenant can. The landlord has to go through an eviction process. I mean, you would agree with me about that, I assume.
unless there was mutual agreement on both sides.
Understood. But if there's not mutual agreement, the landlord's prohibited. They have to go through the process laid out in the bill, but the tenant can end that agreement at any time. Is the tenant required by anything in this proposed bill to provide notice to the property owner?
I see nothing in the bill that says that the tenant has to notify the landlord.
Right. So, I mean, this is another example of where it's not, it may be equitable, but it's not equal and it's not fair. So the landlords can only use the specific reasons. And we talked about some already, and we talked about how even though the property owner owns the property, they do not have the right to use it in the manner that they choose, which means that they would not be able to, for example, offer the property to a friend or a different tenant that they would prefer for whatever reason. They couldn't even do it out of a sense of charity or kindness for someone. Those are not acceptable reasons that are laid out in lines 43 to 58. They could not do it for renovations to improve the quality of the property for a future tenant. They cannot legitimately do it for change of use unless they can demonstrate that it's permanently going to be taken off the market. Selling the property does not resolve any of the requirements of the current owner or future owner. They are still bound by this agreement. If a bank forecloses on a property, Madam Chairman, are they still bound by this agreement too as the new owner of the property?
Let me just check, please. Thank you. According to what we have in this bill, we see nothing to address that.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I just overheard the conversation, and it sounds to me like there may be some debate over whether or not the mortgage company is responsible to carry out this agreement, effectively leaving the tenant in there indefinitely until one of the items in lines 43 to 58 can occur and they are permitted to do an eviction. But it seems to me that they would be. I don't know how they could avoid suggesting they're the owner of the property once it's foreclosed. Also, there's a process of foreclosure where I don't want to get into it right here, but let's just leave it at that. I think that the bank is going to be on the hook for monitoring this policy and maintaining the relationship with the tenant, even if they choose not to. There's a lot of other things too. I mean, can and you might say yes to these things, but I'm going to push back just a little bit to say, in theory, these things can happen, but I'm curious to know how it would actually work in practice. But could you, as a landlord, go through this eviction process to reclaim your property simply because you had complaints from other tenants?
Well, I would say yes if it had to do with health and safety under those conditions. If they complained on that condition of health and safety and pointed it out to them, but not just a regular complaint like, I don't know what else they would be saying, but according to everything that we have in the way of what's acceptable, I don't see anything here that says a verbal complaint from another resident would give justification for.
Thank you. Yeah, no, and yeah, the fact that it's very narrowly tailored is a concern. Most of the public hearing testimony we heard from housing providers on why this bill is a problem. I don't think they contemplated just how big a problem it is, to be honest with you. But the thing that they kept bringing up was the fact that sometimes you have one bad apple in a building, and that person is impacting the other tenants negatively. And I can think of this happening not in any property that I was personally involved in, but investors that I know, where you have one 6-unit apartment building in New Britain, for example, and you have lots of tenants that have been there for many years, and everybody's getting along fine and everybody's happy. And then you have a tenant that shows up, and this person is just drama all the time. There's making a racket late at night, or they bring bugs into the building, or the police are being called, or there's a domestic dispute happening all the time. And what happens is the other 5 tenants, they're losing their peace and enjoyment as a result. And the landlord is trying to do the right thing by trying to help out the other good tenants to make sure that they have a good place to live. But this bill would prevent that landlord from being able to get rid of that difficult tenant. And I think that's an issue. And I mean, the same thing applies too. I mean, it could be complaints from neighbors as well. But I don't see a mechanism that is in the bill that allows the landlord to remove that person without going through the eviction process. How about police activity, Madam Chairman? Is that a sufficient reason if the police are at the residence on a regular basis?
If you don't mind, I'd like to go back to what you mentioned about bringing bugs into the building. I think that would fall under health and safety.
If you could prove it.
If you could prove it, right. And we hope that people can prove what they accuse other people of, right? I don't see anything in here about police being one of the reasons, but I also go back to health and safety. If the police are constantly going to the facility, I would think there's a safety issue.
So, Madam Chairman, I'll just, I'm almost done. I mean, there's so much more I could say about this. A lot of this same concerns that I would say about this bill are going to come up in the other bill that is on our agenda. So I'll reserve some of my remarks there, but I'll just touch on a few things in a little more detail than I did earlier. I mentioned big government. And I'll just get on my soapbox for a second and just say that, government is the threat to most good things. If you want to look and see what's going wrong in the world, you can almost suggest that it's government, because when government grows, effectively the power of the people that serve in government grows. And many people are still going about their lives in America not really worrying about what their government is up to, what's going on in Washington or what's going on at the state capitol, because they grew up in an era where they didn't have to worry too much, that the government was limited in a way where they're not going to do anything that's drastically affecting your life. It's kind of unseen and unheard. And yes, they spend money, and there's various government agencies, and you need driver's licenses and some kind of regulations and stuff like that. But no one really interfering with your freedom, mandating that you put vaccines into your body, or telling you that you have to abide by certain requirements, or telling your school district that they have to accept certain curriculum, even though the school district doesn't want it. I mean, and you just go on and on. These things are happening more and more all the time. And the free exercise of rights that people naturally possess are being limited more and more by government policy. And as that happens, the people in government, as I said, grow in power to start affecting people's lives more. And if you're not watching your government, they're going to be up to no good, in my opinion. And I think far too few people are watching what their government is up to. And I really think that if we had a really engaged public, where people took a genuine interest in what laws were being passed, I think most people would be shocked. I know that people often find out about these policies after they pass. I think the majority of small to medium-sized landlords that are going to be impacted about this bill don't even know it's happening. They're going to find out in a courtroom someday, or when their tenant files a claim with CHRO or something. It scares me. I'll just go back to the fact that as government grows, the influence of the people in government grows. But the reason why they do things is not always, and I mentioned this very briefly. I got Representative Butler's hair up when I was talking about this. I'm not trying to point to any specific person and blame them. I just think this is the nature of what happens. If government has more responsibility and more ways to affect people's lives, it's going to. But what's going to drive the decision making? Is it going to be a really contemplative look at what makes the most sense? Are we going to do an in-depth analysis and try and figure out all the potential ramifications? Or are we just going to react to what we think the people on the street expect or want to hear? And I believe that is what creates a multitude of bad policy. We shift policy based on numbers. There's more employees versus employers. Therefore, when it comes to writing laws, the employers are going to suffer at the hands of the politicians wanting to ingratiate themselves with employees. And this bill is the government trying to find peace with tenants that feel aggrieved, and maybe rightfully so. But the fact of the matter is, it's putting a weight on the scale where it does not belong. If you know the history of America, you know that the concept of government was an anathema to the founders. They wanted to have freedom be the paramount goal of America, not government interfering in private contracts, taking people's property from them, deciding that the best use of their property is what the government says, not that person, what their person believes it is. None of those things are envisioned. And for me, this hits me right where I live, because I love my country and the way it was founded on those principles of freedom and equality. To me, that's what matters to me more than anything. And I trust people. I believe people are genuinely good. And if we have a government, the government should be there just to protect good people and their rights. I mean, that's the reason for it. We even have concepts in our laws to protect against this exact type of legislation. You know, there are tests, you know, that the courts are supposed to apply to law when it comes before them. They're supposed to say, is this clear and unambiguous? You know, otherwise it doesn't stand on its own as a legitimate law, because you can't expect people to follow laws that are vague and hard to follow. And the fact of the matter is, this law is vague and hard to follow. Permanent, what's bona fide? I mean, we have these questions. There's no clarity, and therefore it's going to be an arbitrary decision down the road by some judge or some court that's going to make that decision. And the relying on the statute 7148C, I think it is, the Marxism statute, the one that says that the determination of what an excessive rent relies on how much the landlord owes in debt and how much money the tenant has, that is also completely arbitrary and ambiguous. There's no definite decision. You could give this same set of rules to 20 different people and they'll come up with 20 different answers. That's not how we do laws. In America, the rule of law is paramount. The application of law equally is paramount. That means that everyone should understand what the law says and not have doubt about whether the speed limit is whatever Mr. XYZ thinks, or is it 55 miles an hour? We say it's 55 miles an hour because we're trying to be clear so no one can be the recipient of improper or unfair treatment. But this bill is an open door invitation to unfair treatment because of all of these speculative and arbitrary statutes that are pounded on top of each other. There are two wedges at work here. One of my good friends who's on the staff here, gave me this perspective that the two wedges are that you are getting rid of the ability for the landlord to end the relationship, and you have the fair rent requirements to limit rent. Those two things together prevent landlords having freedom to do what they want with their property, and they effectively create rent control. They effectively create rent control by virtue of suggesting that the landlord's got no way out, and the determination of what fair is going to be an arbitrary amount. I want to just remind people of history, okay? Especially, people that are concerned about discrimination, racism, injustices of the past. Those things are a result of bad laws. Those things are a result of unclear laws. Those things are the result of putting individual people in power of deciding the fate of people. That's different than having the rule of law that's written down and clear and concise, which is what's necessary. It's not, it's up to Steve over there. I'm leaving it up to you, Steve. You're going to decide whether this person's guilty or innocent. That's what's happening here. We're going to leave this up to this vague idea of excessive when it comes to rent amounts, for example. That's not how things should be done. And it is literally an invitation to be abused in a big way. And I have a big concern about it. I mentioned that this is not just a violation of individual property rights, but it is also a intrusion on the right to association. Because in America, the citizens are allowed to decide who they associate with. And if you're forced into a business relationship you don't want to be in by virtue of a statute that doesn't let you out of an agreement, a contractual agreement, then you have lost your right to freely associate. Madam Chairman, direct question. What is the state's compelling interest in putting forth this legislation to become law?
When you say the state, I look at us as legislators, as the state. And we are moving forward on this based on the testimony of over 150 people who gave testimony and gave their personal experiences of what they're facing.
Well, thank you for the answer, but I'm looking for a direct answer to my question. What is the state's interest? What compels the state to have to do this? And when I want to, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, Representative. I'm not.
All right, we're going to call order.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. I appreciated your answer very much, and forgive me for any apparent impropriety. I wasn't trying to be disrespectful at all. I'm trying to get to something I should maybe state more clearly. When I say compelling state interest, I mean a significant goal that the government aims to achieve. So what would be the goal of this legislation that the government aims to achieve by putting this into law?
I would think that we would be addressing some homelessness, that people aren't being displaced without a place to go would be one of the reasons.
Do you have any data to indicate how many people would be displaced if not for this legislation, or how many folks will not be homeless because this is passed?
I don't have the data, but the Partnership for Strong Communities did publish the data. I just don't have it in front of me.
And that what you're suggesting is that passing this law that denies the property rights of the landlord, ignores the expiration date of a mutual binding contract agreed to both parties, and overrides the rights of association of the landlord, that reason that there may be some impact on homelessness is the reason why this justifies overriding those individual rights that are protected by our Constitution?
I don't agree to your summary, first of all. I think there's many things it could address, not just the homelessness, but discrimination does exist. Whether you are in any part of the state, there is discrimination. If we didn't have an ADA, people with disabilities would be ignored. So I think it's both to protect renters from discrimination. I think that's one of the reasons.
Well, thank you for that, Madam Chairman. I'm certainly concerned about discrimination also, and I don't want to see discrimination, but we already have laws to protect against discrimination. In fact, we have the Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities in the state, something that they don't have in a lot of other places. There are numerous mechanisms within state law for someone to bring a claim of discrimination in a rental context How does this differ from those? What is this doing beyond those situations that would fight discrimination?
Well, if you were going to ask me to leave because of the color of my skin, because of my nationality, because of my gender, yes, I could go to CHRO. But you need to disclose that to me if that's the reason that you're asking me to leave the property, and it doesn't fall into the category of what we have.
I understand that, Madam Chairman, but we already described numerous situations where the landlord should have a right to their property for what I think I certainly, and many people, and I think you even acknowledged some of them were legitimate, other reasons that have nothing to do with discrimination. It's just the owner's property, and they want it back because the agreement's over, and they consider the contract signed by both parties as a compelling reason to suggest that they should have a right to their property back. I don't want to beat a dead horse, and but I do want to say that I don't believe that the state has a compelling state interest here. And I also want to just push back a tiny bit on the notion that folks not supporting this bill are not interested in combating discrimination. I mean, I think the bill is discrimination. I think the bill is discriminatory against property owners. And that's no better than being discriminating against tenants. It's no better than being discriminating against people based on gender or race either. All discrimination's bad if it is affecting people in a way that they are treated unfairly and unequally in the eyes of our laws. That's the worst kind of discrimination that there is when you enable policy in the form of statute, in the form of law, with the force of government behind it, to actively discriminate. And that's what this bill does. It takes a private contract and it says that we are going to choose one side to benefit more than the other. And this brings us to rights, by the way. I just want to address this conversation, which is that people were coming to the public hearing and suggesting that housing is a human right. And I don't want to be insensitive, okay? Because I look, people need to have housing, and I believe there are a lot of ways for people to end up with housing. Back in the day, there was enough charity out there to make sure that we didn't have an overwhelming, homeless population. And I think that, that is the best way for it to happen is when people actively care for one another in a way to want to help. Giving the government the job of, well, we're going to tax this group of people, and then we're going to take their money, and then we're going to decide to give it to this group. That's not charity. And the problem is a lot of things are lost in that process, including a lot of money. That money, if it had been directly granted to the people in need, might have actually resulted in a much greater benefit than having to be filtered through government policy. So that's one issue. And again, I am absolutely in favor of mechanisms to end homelessness. I advocate every day when I come here for ways to create more opportunity in the world so people have the chance at better jobs and better housing and a better life. I mean, that is what we all ascribe to. I just don't see that the government passing some unfair rules on different parts of our society is the way to get there. And that will fall in a conversation about economics. But right now I'm talking about rights. And you don't have a right to someone else's property. We talked about it earlier. As much as you would grant me your car, Madam Chairman, I don't have a right to it. And if you said, no, I'm not going to give you my car, then I shouldn't be able to take it. And you don't have a right to someone else's house or apartment either. You don't. And when you sign a contract to rent it, you're agreeing to a fair and free exchange for a period of time. And once that this bill passes and that free and fair agreement between both parties is out the window, we live in a totally different society. And it's an authoritarian society, and it's a very dangerous society. And that's why I'm here spending all of this energy talking and making people sit through my lecture. I'm not doing it for my health. I'm doing it because I don't have any other way to try and stop this from happening. But I believe it's absolutely a necessity to stop this. It is going to be very harmful to people that we all care about. And some folks may not see that. They may be too short-sighted to recognize how this is going to impact not just landlords, which they're clearly aiming this bill at. We're aiming this at landlords to make sure that they can't harm anyone. But in the process, you're going to harm landlords, you're going to harm tenants, and you're going to harm our entire system of laws and justice. And I can see it very, very clearly. But back to my point, which is you don't have a right to someone else's property. And there's no such thing as saying that housing is a human right. There's no such thing as saying that healthcare is a human right, because in order for something to be a right, you have to actually be naturally capable of having it. You can't have housing be a human right because housing comes from someone else. It doesn't come from thin air. It has to come from the fact that someone else possesses the housing or built the actual structure. If you are demanding as a right the labor of some other person, that's immoral. That's why healthcare is not a human right either. People should absolutely have access to affordable and safe housing. People should have access to quality and affordable healthcare, and we work for that every day. But you don't have a right to it, because anything that requires the labor of someone else, you do not have a right to. I just wanted to get that on the record. Stealing is wrong. It just is. Murder is wrong. And our system is founded upon the respect and protection of our natural rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It said in our Declaration of Independence. And also property rights, which are an extension of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And these are all the natural rights that we all have. It's why slavery, as an example, was wrong. Even when it was legal, it was wrong, obviously. Everybody knows it was wrong and immoral from the very first day, and it should never happen. It's a dark stain on the history of this country. But it's why we keep working to try and get back to the goals of that were laid out in that same document. All men are created equal, endowed by their creator with these rights, and that those rights should be protected and should be honored by government. The purpose of government is not to meddle with who gets what or to play favorites in private contracts and transactions. The job here, the one we all signed up for, is to protect and serve and secure those natural rights. That's what we're supposed to be doing. Our system requires consent of the people that we work for, and that means people on all sides of the transactions that we're affecting the policy for. I mentioned earlier that we don't have a divine right. There's no king that that rules over us. It is the actual citizens that are royalty. We are just servants of those kings and queens. That's who we are. We are servants to the people, and they're the ones that hold the power. The people themselves are sovereign, and no person should have authority over another person. No one should also have any more rights than another person. And those rights should not be based on what group someone belongs to. Certainly not whether you're a tenant or a landlord. You shouldn't have more rights than the other person, any more than any gender or race should have more rights than another person. And every time it's been done in our laws that we gave some group based on some characteristic more rights than another, it was wrong. And that's why we shouldn't do this here either. Our job is to protect the rights of all the people. And anything else I consider to be immoral. I'm just going to close with a couple of comments about economics. this is going to have a negative impact on our state's economy. I have no doubt about it. The first thing that's going to happen, obviously, is that you're going to see a direct reaction by housing providers. They're going to be frustrated. They're going to be fearful that their quality of life, the way that they earn an income, is going to be negatively impacted. And there are some people that probably don't care. They're like, well, those people, they're successful enough to own property already. I can tell you that I know many, many people that own property that no one would consider wealthy. People that purchase a two-family house, which I know is not covered under this bill, but it's an example. They're relying on their tenant to help them pay the mortgage, and they're trying to make something of themselves. But even that person ought to be scared, if you ask me, watching what's going on here. And the fact that the government is taking the position that the property owner doesn't have the right to decide what to do with their own house, that the government is going to decide for them how it's to be used. That concerns me greatly, because the right to your own property is something so much a key ingredient in what it means to be an American. And when the government starts to dictate to people, that their property is not theirs anymore or can't be used by them in the way that they choose, it's really dangerous. The next thing that's going to happen is that tenants are going to be impacted. If you think there's a housing shortage now, wait till this happens, because people are going to leave this industry. They just are. Because if you tell people that it is less profitable to be doing something, they're not going to do it. We only have more of things we reward. If we punish things, we have less of it. And that's what's happening here. You are making a choice by voting for this bill to punish housing providers. So you will have less housing provided. It's just natural. If that's just in the short term. The fact of the matter is that I think that it might not even be recoverable in a relatively short period of time, because once you have housing providers leave the market and transfer their property into some other type of service, like, for example, for me, the rental property I own is single family houses. And those are rented right now. So that is actual available rental property in the state for tenants to rent it from. But if it goes away because the property owner, me in this case, says, it's too risky to even be a landlord, I'm going to just sell those houses, and they're going to end up in the hands of families, that are going to use them as their owner-occupied residences. That is housing that will disappear. And we will have an even greater shortage of housing. And that, to me, is not even a question. These are facts, folks. These are not even opinions. I think that any person that you brought in here who was an objective student of economics is going to agree with every word I'm saying here. And they're going to say it's not even worth arguing against me. It will be proven that when you impose strict regulations on housing providers, you'll have less housing providers. When you have less housing providers, you will have more demand for housing. When you have more demand for housing, the price of the housing will naturally go up. And if the government tries to interject and fix prices, guess what? You are going to create more impediment to housing creators. The end result is more government housing. And maybe that's the goal here. Maybe the goal is to have nothing but government housing. But I can tell you that despite the fact that we heard that some of these housing projects are nice and modern and well managed, and I believe that to be true, I don't know that that's true in every case. I know that in the very first bill of the day, we were giving money to community groups to improve housing projects because we didn't trust the housing projects to actually use the money to fix the buildings up themselves. I'm concerned that we're going to end up with less opportunities for property owners and for tenants. And that's how economies work, by the way. When you stifle economic growth and you tell people that they can no longer earn a living, that means that they have less money. And when they have less money to spend, which means they have less money to purchase other goods and services, which means that the whole economy shrinks. The inverse is true also. The reason why our economy grows is when people are creating things and making new things and new ideas and new products, and people buy them and earn a living to be on the assembly line, or to be any part of the process of producing and making new things in the world. Our country is so successful because we've had free markets where people were able to make things, to compete with one another, and to bring new, amazing products and things into the world. And they only did it because they were trying to advance themselves. That's the reason why people go to work every day. That's the reason why Steve Jobs created the Apple or the iPhone. That's the reason why Henry Ford created the assembly line. All of those things were not because they were trying to, bring things to other people. They were trying to make success and wealth for themselves. So when I asked in the hearing the other day whether it's a terrible thing that the property owner makes a profit, and people were aghast, it shocked and scared me, because that tells me that people are being encouraged to look down upon profit. And that only happens in communist societies. And you know what happens in communist societies? There are no cell phones. There are no cars. There are no nice places to live. There are bread lines, poverty, and death. I will take the chance that our society is built on capitalism. And yes, there's great disparity in wealth in capitalism. But the one thing that happens in capitalism is opportunity. That doesn't happen in other systems. People can use their own hard work and their own minds to create things and become successful. And the sky is the limit. And we've seen it over and over again. Look at people that have become successful in America that would never had a chance anywhere else. And that's going away. I mean, I see people around the room, and I imagine what people are thinking about what I'm saying. And those opportunities, I think, are less today than even when I was a kid. And that kills me. And I believe that the reason for those opportunities being less today is because of government. Government is standing in the way of freedom and opportunity and people achieving things and being successful. You know, somebody who's a tenant today who might be struggling might want to be a successful landlord down the road. And in America, they could. If we're going to make it so you can't be a successful landlord or a successful garage owner or a successful anything because it's unfair that some people have success and other people don't, well, guess what? Then no one will have anything. And I feel like sometimes that's what's the goal here. It's like, okay, we're going to make everything equal by bringing everybody down to the bottom. We all benefit when some people do better. I know it sounds crazy, but the fact that some people are extremely successful and rich doesn't hurt a single person. You know, people try and tell stories that somehow if you are poor, it is because someone else has wealth. And that is not true. Those things are not connected at all. There is not one pie of wealth that if one person has a big chunk, you have a small chunk. That is not how it works. The way it works is wealth continues to grow. And every time something is produced in the world, whether it is a new product like a cell phone or a new vehicle or a new anything or a new home, those things being brought into the world are wealth. And our country is extremely wealthy because people worked and produced. And we all benefit from that because even the poorest people in America are better off than they are in communist countries. Even the poorest people, most of them have a cell phone. Most of them have a roof over their head. There are homeless people. I'm not trying to minimize anybody's pain and suffering. I'm just saying that we are far better off because there is an extreme amount of wealth in this country. That means there's more things for people to have a chance at having a piece of it. And the other thing about our system that is based in capitalism and not socialism or communism is that it's a free system, which means it's a moral system. Nothing happens unless both parties want it to. You don't buy something from someone unless you're willing to give them the money for it and they're willing to give you the thing for your money. That's freedom on both sides. That works in employment too. You know, people say they're exploited by their employer, etc. Well, if you have a job, you agree to the terms of the job, and the people are exchanging freely, and that free exchange is what's moral. I mean, and you can complain about all the inequities that happen with it, except for the fact that the inequities in other systems are far more astounding. You might not get to choose what your career is, or where you work, or when you work, or where you live, or how you live, or even if you live in other places in the world. This is a bill that is intended to hurt a class of people because they own property. That's what it's for. I hate to say it in those terms, but that's what it's for. And I don't know if that's based on some misguided notion of social justice, or because there's a true belief that somehow this is the only way to protect people from being harmed by the few tiny percentage of bad actors that exist in the world. But I will tell you that this is not going to end up benefiting anyone. We will all suffer for this. We will have less economic growth. We will have less housing opportunities, higher rents, and fewer places for people to choose from. I cannot support the bill that's before us, Madam Chairman, and I beg of you to reconsider going forward with it today. Thank you.